Hello everyone, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome back to another video using some honeybee stamps. And for today's cards, I was completely inspired by one specific sentiment in the Friendship stamp set. I've had this set sitting beside my desk with the intentions of doing some more galaxy backgrounds because I love making them, and it's been a while since I've made any. So for today's, I used Arches watercolor paper, which I tend to hoard even though it is amazing watercolor paper. I need to make a point of using it, so I force myself to pull it out, even though the funny thing is with galaxy backgrounds, I find you can pretty much use any watercolor paper and get very similar results because you're just making a hot mess, or at least I am anyway. So anyway, I cut some down. Because the sheets are 9 by 12, I just cut it in half and then cut it in half again. So I've got 4.5 by 6 inch pieces. Decided to do 2 because why not? So I taped them down to a hardboard with some painter's tape. And then I pulled out my Gonzai Tombow watercolors because I haven't used these in a while. Someone had asked me the other day, do I still use them? Do I still recommend them? They're great. They're great. I tend to have a lot of watercolors and I bounce around just depending on my mood and what's new and whatever. But yeah, I pulled these out and I sprayed water on the colors I kind of assumed I was going to use because with these, it really helps to get them wet for a bit and then kind of work up the color. So I did that, and then I start with the first panel, which is the one on the left, and I just applied water first just to kind of wet the watercolor paper, and that kind of enables the color to move around a little bit more. And then this is where I'm talking about hot mess. The whole process, especially for me, I see other people do galaxy backgrounds and they just, I don't know, even from the beginning, they just look really, really good. But for me, mine look like a hot mess and it gets worse. It starts like this and then it gets worse. It looks horrible. I've had people comment that they're like, oh, I can't believe it looked so horrible. And then you have the splatter and it looks okay. But yeah, all I do is just splat down a bunch of color. There is no rhyme or reason. There is no method. I am just picking up color, sticking it on paper. I am not even doing any sort of color combos. I've done ones in the past where I'll do reds and pinks and oranges on one, and then I'll do blues and greens and purples on the other, trying not to let colors really blend and get muddy. This time I was I just literally was grabbing colors at random. I really like this kind of mauvey purpley pink color, so I used a fair bit of that. And I will say, Arches watercolor paper, I really do love how color moves on it. It's just, if you've never tried it, you should get yourself some. It's so nice, and especially if you struggle with watercolor, getting the good paper does make a huge difference, whether you're doing galaxy backgrounds or actual watercoloring. So I splatted on all that color, went heavy, covered the whole, almost the entire, both of these pieces, and then sped up the drying process with my embossing tool just to dry it faster. You can let it air dry, it just takes longer, but I wanted this dry, so I sped up the process with the heat tool, and this is where it starts looking like an absolute hot mess. Bear with me. I'm using the black Gonzai Tombow watercolor, and I'm literally taking the dirty watercolor water because I keep one container for the dirty water, the other one's kept clean, so I clean off my brush with the dirty one, and then I go to the clean water to really clean my brush out. But I'm literally taking the dirty watercolor water, mixing it with the black as well, so I have some deeper intense areas of that are more black, and then areas that are a bit lighter. And then I go in and I am tapping on just clean water. I am going to add splatters of some of the actual watercolor, just have fun with it. This is the best. I think this is why I love galaxy background so much, is it's a mess. You get to make a mess, keep making a mess, and have fun with it. Go all the way to the end, because it looks gross right now and it's going to look even worse. But then once you have the splatter, it's oh, it looks like a galaxy. Woo. So that's literally all I did. Now, normally I would paint on this black, do all my splatters, whatever, and then let that dry and then add my, white splatter to make a galaxy. But like most watercolor, this does lighten as it dries. It dries back lighter, and you'll see it as I dry this. Right now it looks fairly black in areas, but once I dry this layer, the color really shows through, which is fine. I'm totally happy with that. I like the color to show through. But it was paler than I wanted it to be. So I'm actually going to go in and add even more black again. And it does look like a hot mess. So I added all that, you know, splatter and water. I purposely added extra water, you know, to get those blooms there. You can especially see it on kind of towards the middle areas. I want that. It creates a really fun effect with Galaxy background. So I dried it, and you can see here how it lightened up so much. So now I'm going to go back in and add a whole bunch more black. I'm just going to go right over it. Same thing, using water and using the dirty water and just almost completely coating this, like no rhyme or reason, just making a big old mess. And it's really fun. There's something really therapeutic about doing this because, you know, you're not trying to stay inside lines or anything. Like, now that I've done these again after so long, I want to do a whole bunch more because it's just something that you can kind of just sit back and experiment, try different colors, different layers, different types of watercolor paper, like do whatever you want. So I went in, added a whole bunch more black watercolor to almost completely coat it. And I did the same thing. I would add like kind of splatters of some the color watercolor, especially that mauvey purple color I like, and some splatters of water as well, just to kind of create those like blooms and lighter areas. And then again, I'm going to completely speed up the drying process with my heat tool because I want this completely dry again. So got this completely dry. And honestly, I could have added even a third layer of the black and really, you know, deepen this, but I was happy here. I might try again sometime and do even more black to get more of that depth and more, you know, of that look. But I do really love, I struggle because I really love that color really peeking through like more. So I was happy here. And then before I do any of the like full on white splatter, there's a like shimmery white color in this Gonzai Tombi set. So I mix that up really well, and I'm going to splatter that on my background. And now this isn't my main, what I call my main splatter, because this does kind of lighten up a fair bit, but it has that little bit of shimmer to it that I love. So I splattered that all over there, dried this all again so that I don't smear it. And then I'm going to remove the tape and use my splat box or just something to protect my surface because the next, you know, level of splatter literally gets everywhere. Like, I'm not joking when I say this makes a mess. I have splatter all over my desk. It gets all over everything, but I don't know. I'm like a child with all of this, having so much fun just splattering around and making a mess. So I remove all the tape. I'm going to put this into my splat box, just, again, something to protect your work surface so you don't get it everywhere. And then I'm going to use white gouache. White acrylic paintworks I really like Ranger's Picket Fence Distress Paint. Copic, my Copic white is also a really good one. And you just a really good white paint. So I really like the white gouache because it stays very white and it's also permanent. And then I have this old toothbrush. I've shown this in other times I've done Galaxy backgrounds. I keep this old toothbrush specifically for this, for splatter. So I added a bit of water to the gouache, tap the toothbrush into it, and then I just run my thumbnail against that toothbrush, and it creates if you want a really fine splatter, that's what the toothbrush is perfect for. So I did that, and then I wanted to add more bigger like blobs of splatter. So then this is where I'm going to use that paintbrush again. And I'm just going to pick up that gouache and water mixture and then tap that on my fingers to create, you know, the larger little dots of splatter here. And then this, again, I sped it up with my heat tool, but I also like set it aside to make sure it was really good and dry before I touch it and end up smearing it. So got these completely covered in that fun splatter, and that's when everything, you know, it looks completely different than it did when I was adding that black and looking like I was making a hot mess. So once these are dry, I'm trimming them down to about 4 and 5 1/4 inches. I wanted them slightly smaller than an A2 card front. So I just used my Tim Holtz trimmer and trimmed off all of those edges. And then once I have those trimmed down, there are these little starburst images in the Friendship stamp set. And I thought those would look really nice on this background. I've seen people like hand draw a little starburst, which is great, but sometimes I'm okay with I'll add little hand drawn elements, but I really liked the shape of these little starbursts, and I thought they would look so nice on this background if I heat emboss them. So I tested it out first. I used my anti-static powder tool and then just poured the emboss powder over to make sure that it actually was dry. But again, this is where you have a bit of leeway, because even if you did get some stray embossing powder, you know, accidentally on this background and ended up, you know, melting them with your heat tool, it would look fine. It would just blend in with all the splatter and everything going on. So I lined everything up into my stamp platform because I knew I would want to stamp these a couple of times because it is still a very textured surface. So I lined up those 3 little starbursts from the set, and then I'm stamping them with clear embossing ink, and ended up stamping them 2 or 3 times just to make sure that I got them fully stamped. And then I'm going to pour over some silver embossing powder. And this is definitely one of those things like where in the video it's harder to see, but once it's melted and the light hits it, it's just with the background and just everything. It just made me happy. So I'm going to stamp those, coat those with the silver embossing powder, tap off the excess, and then melt those with my heat tool. And I'm going to do that to both of these watercolor backgrounds. So that's also why it's nice having the platform to stamp everything, because then it's all lined up and I just have to stick the next one in, stamp it, heat emboss it, I'm good to go. So I did that, and then the sentiment that inspired this entire card from the set that says, "Good friends are like stars. You don't always see them, but you know they're always there." I'm going to line that up over some, I have this silvery vellum from my stash, which I'm sorry, I think it's discontinued. I linked to something somewhat similar, a pack that I think has similar vellum in it. Regular vellum was going to work. That's actually what I was going to use, is just regular vellum. But then I pulled that out and I was like, ooh, this works with the silver embossing powder and the whole theme. So I'm going to stamp the sentiment and then heat emboss that, and it takes no time at all. Heat embossing on vellum is completely different than heat embossing on anything else. Embossing powder melts almost instantly on vellum. So you go, you know, quick, melt it, remove the heat tool. Do not, you know, overheat it because you will warp the vellum. You can burn it really easily. So I melted the first sentiment, and then I just flipped this piece around so I can stamp it a second time because everything's already lined up. So quick and easy. So I'm going to stamp this a second time with the clear embossing ink. And again, I was using my anti-static powder tool, so I'm not getting, especially on this one, I'm a little more concerned with stray embossing powder. Wasn't concerned with the background because it wouldn't matter, but on the vellum, I want to make sure I don't get embossing powder on anything other than the sentiment. So now I'm going to coat it again with that silver embossing powder, melt that in a few seconds with my heat tool, and then clean up my embossing powder and whatnot and get that set aside, put the lid on that so I don't knock it over, because that happens more times than I can count. And then I'm going to trim these down into 2 separate pieces, again using my Tim Holtz trimmer here, just kind of eyeballing it to similar sizes here, just above and below the sentiment. And then once I have these trimmed down, to adhere them to that galaxy background, I'm literally just going to kind of wrap the vellum around and tape it to the back of the piece with washi tape, because you're not going to see the back, so it doesn't matter. You can use whatever you want. You can use a tape runner. I used to always use Scotch tape, but I always have washi tape sitting here because I use it with my wafer dies. So I just kind of used my grid mat to make sure everything was straight, fold over those edges, and then tape them down, and it's good to go. So I'm going to do that to both pieces. And then off camera, I also coated the back of both of these galaxy backgrounds with foam adhesive. So I'm going to put foam tape on the back of both of these so that, because even though I had taped them down when I did all that watercoloring, I used a lot of water plus all the heat, etc. So they're a little bit warped, but not much. But when I've warped things like that, I like using the foam tape, 1, because it pops it up and gives it that extra bit of dimension, and 2, because it adheres it really, really well to the card base. So speaking of the card bases, I'm using more sentiments from that same set, because I always sound like a broken record, but that's why Honeybee's sentiment sets are some of my favorites, because you can like mix and match and build and like spell out basically your own sentiments to work with whatever it is you're creating. So that's what I did here. I stamped the large friendship word from the set on the inside of both of the card bases with the clear embossing ink, and I'm going to heat emboss them with that silver embossing powder just to give it that little extra something. So stamp those, heat emboss them, and then I'm going to line up the rest of the words to build the actual sentiment. So it says, "Your friendship means the world to me." So I'm going to add those other stamps again in my platform, because then I can do, like, I do the one card base and then I can just pull that out, stick in the second one, and be done in like one step. So the second part of the sentiment I'm going to stamp with just black ink. And then once I have that stamped, I also wanted to use those little starburst images again. And this time, rather than heat emboss them, I just stamped them with Delicata Silvery Shimmer ink, which doesn't get the justice it deserves on camera, but it has this very subtle sheen to it in real life. Like when the light hits it, it's not as intense as silver embossing powder, but it's just nice and subtle. So I pulled that out and decided to use that just to give it that little extra something as well. So I lined up those stars, and then I'm just going to ink it up with that Silver Shimmer ink. And I gotta say, this stamped perfectly. I thought I would have to stamp it more than once, just because. It's kind of a habit half the time, but these stamped perfectly. So I stamped the first card base, pulled out the second, and inked up those stamps with that ink. And then, if you really wanted these to really pop, you could add, I've shown that in other videos as well, using like Perfect Pearls powder, just to give it that extra shimmer. But I just wanted to have those stamped to kind of tie it all together with the front of the card. So after I had those stamped, I'm going to press on both of these watercolor galaxies onto my card bases. And that's going to finish off the cards. I'm not going to add any other embellishments. Shocking, I know. No rhinestones, nothing. I wanted it to be like the splatter in the background and the shimmer from the sentiment, everything, just to kind of speak for itself. So as always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have a supply list with links to all the supplies I use. You can check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!